They say that fire is the great purifier, but for those caught in its heart, it is something far more cruel. It doesn't just burn away the past, it consumes the light, chokes the air from your lungs, and waits until you are at your weakest to strip away everything you ever loved, leaving only ashes and silence in its wake. Lena Calloway understood that truth with terrifying clarity as the heat of the Belloti estate licked at her heels. She stood at the jagged edge of the Black Ridge woods, her face smudged with the soot of her former life, staring back at the orange glow devouring the only home she had ever known. The gates were locked, the deal was broken, and they had exactly 0 seconds to disappear before the shadows reached them. Pressed tightly against her chest, 7-year-old Micah was trembling, his small hands clutching the torn fabric of her red shirt as if it were an anchor in a storm. He didn't know that their parents had been executed in the marble hallway just minutes before the first match was struck. He only knew the heat, the smoke, and the way his sister's heart was drumming a frantic, desperate rhythm against his ear, a rhythm that told him the nightmare hadn't ended with the fire. It was just moving into the trees. The smell of expensive cedar and aged bourbon, which usually defined the Calloway study, was gone, erased by the stinging, chemical stench of gasoline and the roar of a house that had suddenly turned into an oven. Every breath Lena took felt like swallowing hot needles, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't even look back at the grand staircase where she had last seen her father, his back turned to her, a silver handgun leveled at the mahogany doors as the first wave of Andre Belloti's cleaners breached the estate. "Don't look, Micah. Just keep your eyes on my back," Lena rasped, her voice cracking under the weight of the smoke. She felt the boy's small fingers digging into the flesh of her waist, his face pressed so hard against her shoulder that she could feel the dampness of his tears soaking through her torn red shirt. They were moving through the servants' passage, a narrow artery of the house that the Belloti men, in their arrogant fury, had likely overlooked. But the heat was finding them even here. The walls groaned as the structural beams began to surrender, and the ornate wallpaper, the gold leaf patterns she had traced with her fingers as a child, was bubbling and peeling away like blistered skin. Her mother had been the one to shove them into this dark corridor. There had been no time for a long goodbye, only a frantic, trembling hand cupping Lena's cheek and a whispered command that carried the weight of a final blessing. "Run until the light of the fire can't find you. Run until you hit the trees, and don't stop for the screams." Lena had heard them. As they scrambled toward the rear exit, the sound of glass shattering and a rhythmic, hollow thud-thud-thud of silenced weapons echoed through the vents. Her mother's voice had been silenced mid-sentence, replaced by the heavy boots of men who didn't care about the legacy of the Calloways, only about the vacuum of power they were hired to fill. They burst through the heavy oak service door and into the night air, but there was no relief. The manicured back lawn was illuminated by the flickering orange glow of the inferno behind them. The estate was a crown of fire against the dark New Orleans sky. "Lena, I'm scared," Micah whimpered, his voice small and fragile against the roar of the blaze. "I know, baby. I know," she whispered, though her own heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She didn't tell him that the shadows moving near the fountain weren't tricks of the light. She didn't tell him that the metallic clack echoing across the stone patio was the sound of a rifle being chambered. She scooped him up, her muscles screaming with a sudden, adrenaline-fueled strength, and bolted toward the ragged line of black timber that marked the start of the Black Ridge woods. Behind them, a shout went up, a jagged, hungry sound. Andre Belloti's men had spotted the movement. The transition from the scorched grass to the forest floor was like falling into another world. The ground became uneven, a graveyard of roots and rotting leaves that threatened to trip her at every step. The air here was different, unnaturally cold, smelling of ancient dampness and something metallic, like old blood. Lena didn't stop until the thick canopy swallowed the orange glow of the burning house, leaving them in a suffocating, ink-black silence. She collapsed against the trunk of a massive, gnarled oak, pulling Micah into the hollow of her lap. She covered his mouth with her hand, not to silence his crying, but to muffle the sound of her own ragged, sobbing breaths. In the distance, the estate was a dying star, but here, in the deep press of the timber, the silence felt heavy. It felt like a presence. As Lena stared into the darkness, she realized that while the fire and the shooters were behind them, the woods didn't feel empty. The Black Ridge was breathing, a slow, rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate in the very dirt beneath her fingernails. They had escaped the treason of man, but as the first swirl of gray ash began to drift down through the leaves like winter snow, Lena realized the woods had been waiting for them. The heavy silence of the Black Ridge was unlike any silence Lena had ever known. In the city, and even within the fortified walls of the Belloti estate, the quiet was always artificial, merely the absence of voices or the hum of engines. Here, the silence felt dense and deliberate, pressing against her eardrums like deep water. It carried a weight that made her feel as though she and Micah were trespassers in a cathedral built of shadow and bone. "Lena, are they still coming?" Micah's voice was a microscopic thread of sound against the vast, dark backdrop of the woods. He hadn't stopped shaking since they crossed the tree line, his small frame vibrating with a terror that physical exhaustion couldn't dull. "Sure, baby. Not yet. We just need to keep moving," Lena murmured. She didn't know if it was the truth. For all she knew, Belloti's cleaners were already fanning out through the brush with thermal scopes and trained dogs. But in this place, the rules she had lived by her entire life, the hierarchy of the mob, the certainty of iron and concrete, seemed to be evaporating. The woods didn't care about the Calloways or the Bellotis. She forced her aching legs to move, carrying Micah deeper into the thicket. Her feet sank into layers of moss and decaying leaves that felt alarmingly soft, as if the forest floor were a living tongue swallowing her footsteps. Branches clawed at her torn red shirt, and thorns drew thin lines of fire across her exposed skin, but she welcomed the pain. It was the only thing anchoring her to reality. Then, the air changed. It didn't just grow colder, it became thick and gritty. Lena blinked, realizing her vision was blurring, not from tears, but from a sudden, heavy mist that seemed to rise directly out of the black earth. It wasn't the clean, damp fog of a Louisiana morning. This was dry, suffocating, and carried the unmistakable, phantom scent of a burnt-out hearth. Ashfall. Lena froze mid-step, her breath hitching. Drifting down through the canopy were tiny, gray flakes. At first, she thought the fire from the estate had followed them, that the wind was carrying the debris of her burning home deep into the timber. But as a large, heavy flake landed on her forearm, she realized with a jolt of pure ice in her veins that it wasn't hot. It was freezing. She stared down at her skin. The speck was the color of a gravestone. When she tried to brush it off, it didn't smear like normal charcoal. It clung to her, leaving a faint, gray stain that seemed to pulse against her flesh. "Lena, look," Micah whispered, his voice rising in pitch. He was pointing ahead, buried deep in her arms. Through the thick, swirling gray curtain, the trees themselves seemed to be changing. The gnarled bark was coated in a thick, velvety layer of the gray substance, making the forest look like a monochrome photograph. But it wasn't static. The fog seemed to coil and roll around the trunks with a slow, predatory intelligence, mimicking shapes that shouldn't be there. For a terrifying, fleeting second, Lena thought she saw the outline of a towering, faceless figure standing between the pines. The entity did not move. It didn't make a sound. It simply existed, a vast, suffocating presence that watched them with the cold, patient eyes of history itself. A primitive instinct, older than any fear of Andre Belloti's rifles, screamed at Lena to turn and run. But there was nowhere to go. Behind them lay the ashes of her family and the men who wanted them dead. Ahead lay a living nightmare that defied the laws of the world she knew. Tightening her grip on Micah until he let out a soft grunt of protest, Lena swallowed the scream building in her throat and took a trembling step forward, crossing the invisible border into the heart of the ridge. The gray snow of the Ashfall continued to drift through the canopy, settling on Lena's eyelashes and the collar of Micah's jacket like the frozen breath of a ghost. Every step felt heavier than the last, the ground beneath her boots turning into a treacherous slurry of silver dust and rotted pine needles. Just as the cold began to seep into her bones, a hollow, aching chill that felt less like winter and more like grief, the trees broke. In the center of a small, jagged clearing stood a structure that looked less like a house and more like a wound stitched together with timber. It was a low-slung cabin, its walls reinforced with rusted sheets of metal and thick, black vines that seemed to pulse in time with the wind. "Stay behind me, Micah," Lena whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for the small kitchen knife she'd tucked into her waistband back at the estate. The door didn't creak when it opened. It swung wide with a heavy, purposeful thud. Standing in the threshold was a man who looked as though he had been carved from the very oaks that surrounded them. His hair was a wild mane of salt and pepper, and his eyes, sharp and unervingly clear, seemed to see right through the soot on Lena's face to the terror she was trying so hard to hide. "You're a long way from the marble floors of the Belloti place, Calloway," the man said. His voice was like grinding stones. Lena stiffened, her heart hammering against her ribs. "How do you know that name?" "The wind carries the scent of burning cedar and treason for miles," he replied, stepping aside to reveal a dim, firelit interior. "I'm Blaine Corver. If you want the boy to keep those toes, get inside. The Ashfall is particularly hungry tonight." Desperation outweighed suspicion. Lena hurried into the warmth, the smell of dried herbs and wood smoke hitting her with the force of a physical blow. Blaine didn't ask questions. He moved with a practiced, clinical efficiency, pointing Lena toward a bench covered in moth-eaten furs. He brought a basin of steaming water infused with stinging nettle and a pungent, dark oil. As he began to clean the deep, jagged scratches on Micah's legs, the boy let out a soft whimper. Blaine's hands, though calloused and scarred, were surprisingly gentle. He worked in silence until the worst of the grime was gone, then turned his attention to the burn on Lena's shoulder where a falling ember had caught her. "Why are you helping us?" Lena asked, her voice trembling as the warmth of the cabin began to thaw the numbness in her chest. "Everyone else who knows our name is trying to erase it." Blaine paused, his gaze flickering to the window, where the gray flakes were thick against the glass. "I don't help for free, girl. And I don't help because I'm kind. I help because the ridge doesn't like waste." He stood up, crossing the room to stoke the hearth. The flames flared blue for a second before returning to orange. "You think you escaped Andre Belloti," Blaine said, his back to her. "And maybe you did. His men are afraid of the dark, and they're even more afraid of what the fog does to a man's mind. But don't mistake this silence for safety." He turned back, his expression grim. "These woods, they don't have laws, but they have a ledger. Everything here is a trade. The fire gave you life, but it took your home. I give you shelter, but the ridge will want its due. This land collects debts in ways the Mafia can't even dream of. It takes your memories, it takes your peace, and eventually, it asks for a piece of your soul." Micah looked up, his wide eyes reflecting the dying embers. "Does it take people too?" Blaine looked at the boy for a long moment, a flicker of something like pity crossing his weathered face. "Only the ones who try to leave without paying the bill. Sleep now. Tomorrow, the woods will start counting." Lena pulled Micah closer, the warmth of the fire doing little to settle the new, cold dread settling in her stomach. She had traded the fire for the fog, and as she watched the gray ash pile up against the door, she wondered just how much the Black Ridge would demand in return. The next morning, the world outside the cabin was no longer green or brown. It was a ghost landscape of monochromatic gray. The Ashfall had stayed through the night, coating the jagged pines in a thick, velvety layer of silt that seemed to swallow the morning sun. Inside, the fire had burned down to glowing orange eyes in the hearth, but the warmth it provided felt superficial, unable to touch the deep, rhythmic chill vibrating through the floorboards. Lena watched Micah as he sat by the frost-rimmed window. He wasn't playing with the carved wooden bird Blaine had left on the table. He was leaning his head against the glass, his eyes wide and vacant, fixed on the swaying movement of the trees. "Micah, eat something," Lena said, pushing a small bowl of thin, bitter porridge toward him. The boy didn't move. He tilted his head as if listening to a frequency just beyond Lena's reach. "Do you hear that, Lena? Mama is calling. She says she found her earrings. The gold ones she lost under the dresser." The spoon fell from Lena's hand, clattering against the wood. A cold sweat broke out across her neck. Her mother had lost those earrings a month ago. They had laughed about it over coffee, back when the estate was still a place of sunlight and safety. "Micah, don't. Mama isn't in the woods," Lena said, her voice shaking. She reached for him, but he flinched away, his gaze returning to the shifting gray fog. "She's crying," Micah whispered, his lip trembling. "She says the fire is still hot. She says Papa is waiting by the gate, but he can't find the key." "Enough!" Lena's shout was too loud for the small room. She immediately pulled him into her lap, burying her face in his hair, but even as she held him, she heard it too. A faint, melodic humming, the exact tune her mother used to hum while sketching in the garden, wafted through the gaps in the cabin walls. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from the Ashfall. Blaine emerged from the back room, his heavy boots thudding with an ominous weight. He didn't look surprised. He looked at the gray dust piling up on the windowsill and then at the hollow circles under Micah's eyes. "I told you the ridge collects debts," Blaine said, his voice lower than usual. "The Ashfall isn't just soot, girl. It's a mirror. It's made of the things that have been burned away, the history of this land, the blood spilled in the dirt, and the grief you brought with you from that burning house." Lena looked at him, horror dawning on her. "You mean it's using our memories?" "It feeds on them," Blaine explained, crossing to the door and throwing the bolt. "The more you mourn, the thicker the fog gets. It mimics the voices of the dead to draw you out into the deep brush. It wants you to wander off until you become part of the silt yourself. To the ridge, your sorrow is just another form of energy." Outside, the humming grew louder, joined by the distinct, frantic sound of her father's laughter, the booming, joyful sound he used to make when he'd won a hand at poker. It was so real, so visceral, that Lena felt a physical ache in her chest, a desperate urge to run out into the gray and find him. "It's not them, Lena," Blaine warned, stepping between her and the door as if sensing her impulse. "The Mafia sent men with guns to kill you. The woods are sending something much worse, your own heart. If you listen to those echoes, if you let that grief take root, you'll walk straight into a grave you dug for yourself." Micah began to sob, a low, broken sound that seemed to synchronize with the wailing of the wind. Lena gripped him tighter, her knuckles white. She realized then that the Black Ridge wasn't just a place they were hiding in. It was a predator that had already tasted their pain. To survive Andre Belloti, she just had to stay hidden. To survive the timber, she had to do something far harder. She had to lock her grief in a box and refuse to let the woods hear her scream. The Ashfall did not lift with the passing hours. It simply grew heavier, turning the world into a claustrophobic cage of gray velvet. Inside the cabin, the silence was broken only by the wet snap of the fire, but outside, the woods had begun to vibrate with a different kind of energy. It wasn't the spectral humming of the dead this time. It was the rhythmic, calculated crunch of tactical boots on frozen silt. Blaine stood by the heavy oak door, his head tilted, his nostrils flaring like an animal catching a scent on the wind. "They're here," he whispered. "Belloti's elite. They don't use sirens, and they don't shout. They move like ink and water." Lena felt a cold spike of adrenaline pierce through her exhaustion. She stood up, pulling Micah into the shadow of the heavy stone hearth. "How many?" "4. Maybe 5, Blaine replied, reaching for a long, blackened bough leaning against the wall. "They've got thermal tech, but the Ashfall is thick with mineral silt. It scrambles the sensors, turns everything into a blur of gray heat. They're blind, Lena. That makes them dangerous. A blind predator bites at anything that moves. The first sign of their presence wasn't a sight, but a sound. The sharp, metallic click of a mag light being toggled. A beam of artificial white light cut through the fog 50 yards out, looking weak and sickly against the oppressive gray. Then came the voice, amplified by a comms unit, sounding tinny and dead in the heavy air. Lena Calloway, we know you're in the timber. Andre just wants to talk. He says the fire was a mistake, an overzealous captain. Come out now, and the boy stays safe. Lena's grip on her kitchen knife tightened until her knuckles turned white. The lie was so hollow it almost made her laugh. She knew the Belloti way. They didn't leave witnesses, and they certainly didn't leave heirs. Don't move, Blaine commanded, his voice a mere vibration. The cabin is shielded with lead paint scrap and salt rot. To their scanners, we're just another hill of dirt. But if you break the line of the door, you're a target. Through a narrow slit in the reinforced window, Lena watched the hunters move. They were shadows in high-tech carbon fiber, moving in a tight diamond formation. They were professional, efficient, and utterly out of their element. Every time one of them stepped too close to a gnarled root, the ashfall would swirl aggressively around their ankles, as if the forest itself were trying to trip them. Suddenly, one of the trackers stopped. He swung his rifle toward a dense thicket of briars to the left of the cabin. Movement. 10 o'clock. He opened fire. The suppressed thud-thud-thud of the submachine gun tore through the silence, shredding the gray mist. But there was no cry of pain, no sound of a falling body. Instead, the woods answered with a low, guttural groan, the sound of ancient wood shifting under immense pressure. They're shooting at the echoes, Blaine whispered, a grim smile touching his lips. The ridge is playing back the sound of their own heartbeats. They think they're surrounded. The lead tracker barked an order, and the diamond formation broke. Panic, the one thing elite training couldn't fully suppress, began to seep into their movements. They started moving faster, their boots heavy and careless, tearing through the silt. They're coming closer to the porch, Lena hissed, her heart hammering against Micah's head. Let them, Blaine said, his fingers tightening on the bowstring. The further they come into the Black Ridge, the more the ashfall takes. They think they're hunting you, Lena, but they haven't realized yet that the woods have already started the count. They're not trackers anymore. They're offerings. As a shadow loomed over the cabin's front step, the gray fog outside turned a violent, bruised purple. The game of cat and mouse had reached its tipping point, and for the first time since the estate burned, Lena didn't feel like the prey. She felt like the bait in a much larger trap. The tracker's shadow retreated from the door, his boots splashing through the thick, gray silt as he signaled a retreat toward the higher ground of the ridge. Inside the cabin, the blue-tinged firelight cast long, jagged shadows against the walls. Blaine lowered his bow, but the tension didn't leave his shoulders. He turned toward Lena, his eyes reflecting a cold, ancient clarity. You think they're here because they're brave, Blaine said, his voice dropping into a register that felt as heavy as the ashfall itself. They aren't. They're here because Andre Belloti is terrified. He knows what I know. He knows that once you cross the line into this timber, you stop being a citizen and start being a ghost. Lena shifted Micah, who had finally fallen into a shallow, fitful sleep against the stone of the hearth. You talk about him like you've looked him in the eye, Blaine. You aren't just some hermit who got lost in the woods. Blaine walked to a floorboard near the back of the cabin, prying it up to reveal a small, tarnished metal box. He didn't open it. He simply rested his hand on the lid. 10 years ago, I wasn't Blaine Corver. I was the man who built the vaults for the Belloti family. I was the architect of their secrets. I thought I was indispensable, right up until the moment Andre decided that dead men kept secrets better than stone and steel. He looked at the window, where the purple-gray fog was swirling with a renewed, predatory vigor. I fled here just like you. I thought the woods were an enemy. I fought the ashfall for 3 years, screaming at the voices of the people I'd lost, trying to outrun a fog that was made of my own shame. But the ridge doesn't want your blood, Lena. It wants your resolve. Lena stood up, her hand finding the hilt of the kitchen knife. The weight of it felt pathetic now, a toy against the monsters in the mist. It's feeding on Micah. It's using my mother's voice to lure him out. How can you ask me to trust a thing like that? I'm not asking you to trust it. I'm asking you to command it, Blaine countered, stepping closer. The air between them grew thick with the scent of ozone and burnt cedar. The Ashfall is a manifestation of every injustice this land has ever swallowed. It's the grief of the Calloways, the betrayal of the Corvers, and the blood of every man Andre Belloti ever discarded. It isn't a monster. It's a storm. And right now, you're trying to hide from the wind when you should be directing the lightning. He pointed toward the door. Outside, the tracker's mag lights were flickering again, cutting desperate, erratic arcs through the haze. They were lost, their internal compasses shattered by the ridge's shifting geometry. You have a choice, Blaine whispered. You can stay in this cabin until the fire goes out and the trackers find a way through the salt rot. You can let the Ashfall consume your memories until there's nothing left of Lena Calloway but a pile of gray dust. Or you can open that door and give the woods what it's been waiting for. And what is that? Lena asked, her pulse thundering. A target for its hunger, Blaine said. Stop mourning the estate. Stop running from the fire. Take that grief, that burning rage you feel for the parents they took from you, and throw it at the men outside. The Ashfall is a weapon, Lena, but it only strikes for those who are willing to stop being the prey. Lena looked at Micah's pale, soot-streaked face, then back at the door. The fear that had paralyzed her since the first match was struck at the estate didn't vanish, but it transformed. It sharpened into a cold, diamond-hard edge. She realized then that she was tired of being the girl in the torn red shirt, huddled in the dark. She walked to the door and gripped the heavy iron bolt. The metal was freezing, vibrating with the low, rhythmic hum of the forest. She wasn't just opening a door. She was signing a covenant with the very thing that had been haunting her. Help me protect him, she whispered, not to Blaine, but to the gray world outside. As she threw the bolt and stepped onto the porch, the Ashfall didn't pull away. It rushed toward her, coiling around her arms like a shroud, waiting for her command. The porch of the cabin felt like the edge of a precipice, the transition point between the world of the living and the realm of the forgotten. Lena stepped out into the swirling purple-gray mist, her torn red shirt fluttering in a wind that didn't feel like air, but like a heavy, electric current. Behind her, the door clicked shut, the salt rot and lead shielding sealing Micah safely inside with Blaine. She was alone now, the only living spark in a forest of ash. You want a debt? Lena whispered, her voice projecting into the fog. Then take it. Take all of it. She didn't run. She walked with a deliberate, haunting slowness toward the gray zone, a depression in the landscape where the timber grew in twisted, unnatural spirals and the ashfall was so thick it lay on the ground like a waist-high lake of silk. This was the heart of the ridge's hunger, a place where the barrier between memory and reality was non-existent. As she walked, she purposefully tore down the mental walls she had spent the last 48 hours building. She reached into the raw, bleeding center of her mind and pulled out the image of her father's smile, the sound of her mother's humming, and the smell of the smoke as the estate began to burn. She broadcast her grief like a beacon, a psychic flare intended to draw every predator in the woods toward her. The effect was instantaneous. The ashfall began to churn violently, rising in towering plumes that mimicked the silhouettes of the very people she was mourning. Spectral shapes, flickering, translucent versions of the Calloway family, began to drift through the trees, their voices rising in a discordant, heartbreaking chorus. Over there. I see her. The shout came from the lead Belloti tracker. The mag lights swung toward her, their beams struggling to penetrate the soup of gray particles. To the hunters, Lena looked like a ghost herself, a flickering red shape dancing through a graveyard of ash. She's heading into the hollow. Don't let her slip away. Lena led them deeper. She could hear their heavy breathing, the clatter of their gear, and the growing panic in their radio chatter as the forest began to play back their own fears. Every time a tracker looked at a shadow, the Ashfall molded itself into a threat, a raised gun, a lunging figure, a vengeful face. She reached the center of the gray zone and stopped. The silt was up to her knees, cold and vibrating with a low, hungry hum. She turned to face the four shadows emerging from the tree line, their rifles raised, their tactical visors glowing a sickly green in the dark. End of the line, Calloway. The lead man barked, stepping into the clearing. His boots sank into the ash, and he stumbled, his composure fracturing as he realized the ground wasn't solid. Lena didn't answer with words. She looked at the man and thought of the moment the first bullet hit the library door. She projected the sheer, unadulterated terror of that second into the space between them. The Ashfall responded with a deafening roar. The fog didn't just swirl, it solidified. The memories Lena had offered up as bait were suddenly snatched away by the woods and redirected. The hunters weren't seeing a girl in a red shirt anymore. They were seeing the fire. They were seeing the faces of every man they had ever killed, rising out of the gray silt like a tide of white-hot vengeance. "What is that? Get it off me!" one of the men screamed, firing blindly into the mist. The muzzle flashes illuminated a nightmare. The Ashfall was coiling around them, mimicking the shape of hands, pulling at their tactical vests, dragging them down into the hollow. The more they fought, the more the forest fed on their aggression. Lena stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos, a calm eye in a storm of gray. She wasn't the prey anymore. She was the conductor of the ridge's wrath, watching as the woods began to collect the debt that Belloti's men had so arrogantly brought into the timber. The trap was sprung, and for the first time, the silence of the woods felt like justice. The screams of the elite trackers were being swallowed by the Ashfall, muffled as if they were occurring miles away rather than a few yards from where Lena stood. One by one, the maglights flickered and died, leaving only the bruised, purple radiance of the woods to illuminate the carnage. The men who had arrived with the certainty of modern weapons were now clawing at the air, their lungs filling with the cold, gritty silt of 1,000 forgotten tragedies. But the heavy thrum of the forest didn't subside. Instead, it deepened, the ground beneath Lena's feet vibrating with a rhythmic, subterranean growl. From the shadows of the twisted pines, a final figure emerged. Belloti did not wear tactical gear. He stepped into the gray zone wearing a tailored wool coat that looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of the supernatural storm. In his hand was a heavy-caliber revolver, its chrome finish reflecting the sickly light of the Ashfall. His face, usually a mask of aristocratic boredom, was contorted with a frantic, twitching rage. "You think this saves you, Lena?" Belloti's voice was strained, cracking under the weight of the atmosphere. "You think you can hide behind these ghost stories? I built this city. I own every shadow in it." He leveled the gun at her heart, his hand shaking. The Ashfall began to coil around his wrist like a serpent, but he fought it off with a snarl of pure, stubborn malice. Lena didn't flinch. She didn't even raise her hand to shield herself. She looked into the eyes of the man who had ordered the execution of her parents, and for the first time since the fire, she felt a profound, chilling stillness. The fear that had been her constant companion, the cold knot in her stomach that told her she was small and helpless, simply dissolved. "The city is made of concrete, Lena said, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the vacuum of the woods. "But this land is made of memory, and it remembers you." She thought of the library. She thought of her mother's final, desperate shove into the dark. She didn't offer the woods her grief this time. She offered it her judgment. The Ashfall responded with a violence that shook the very roots of the timber. A massive, towering pillar of gray silt rose behind Lena, taking the shape of a colossal, faceless guardian. It wasn't just her parents' memories now. It was the collective weight of every soul the Belloti family had ever crushed. Belloti fired. The roar of the gun was deafening, but the bullet didn't reach her. It hit a wall of dense, solidified ash inches from Lena's face and fell to the ground, harmless as a pebble. "My turn," Lena whispered. She stepped forward, and as she did, the entity lunged. It didn't strike like a physical blow. It moved through Belloti like a cold front. The mob boss let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was a hollow, rattling gasp as the Ashfall stripped away his arrogance. He dropped the gun, his eyes wide and vacant, staring into the mist at things only he could see. He saw the fire he had started. He saw the lives he had extinguished. The forest wasn't killing him. It was forcing him to feel the weight of every debt he had ever refused to pay. The ground seemed to open up, the silt swirling into a localized vortex. Belloti didn't struggle. He simply sank, his expensive coat disappearing into the gray lake of the ridge, until only the silence remained. The purple light faded, replaced by the soft, natural blue of a pre-dawn sky. The suffocating pressure in Lena's chest lifted. She turned back toward the cabin, seeing Blaine standing on the porch with Micah clutching his hand. The ashfall was still falling, but it was light now, gentle, like the first snow of winter. Lena walked toward them, her head held high, the soot on her face no longer a mark of a victim, but the war paint of a survivor. She had looked into the heart of the monster and the heart of the woods, and she had discovered they were both afraid of the same thing, a girl who refused to break. The silence that followed the collapse of the Belloti Empire was not the hollow, terrifying void Lena had first encountered at the edge of the timber. It was a living silence, thick with the scent of damp earth and the sweet, sharp promise of pine. As the last of the purple light bled out of the sky, replaced by the soft, milky gold of a true sunrise, the ashfall began to change. The gray flakes no longer felt like frozen grief. They drifted down like cherry blossoms, dissolving before they touched the ground, as if the land itself were finally exhaling a breath it had held for a century. Lena stood in the center of the clearing for a long time, watching the spot where Andre Belloti had vanished. There was no mark on the ground, no headstone to record his passing. The ridge had simply reclaimed what was theirs, folding his malice into the deep, dark layers of the earth where it could no longer hurt the living. She felt a strange, quiet lightness in her chest, as if the fire that had consumed her home had finally burned itself out, leaving behind a soil that was rich, fertile, and entirely her own. When she walked back to the cabin, the heavy iron bolt was already retracted. Blaine stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the warmth of the hearth. He didn't ask what had happened in the gray zone. He simply looked at the way she carried herself, the steady set of her shoulders and the clarity in her eyes, and nodded once. It was the nod of one survivor recognizing another who had finally found their footing. Micah ran to her, his small feet thumping against the porch boards. Lena scooped him up, burying her face in his neck. He didn't smell like smoke or fear anymore. He smelled like the wood smoke from Blaine's fire and the fresh, cold air of the morning. "Is the monster gone, Lena?" he whispered, his voice clear and free of the echoes that had haunted him. "The monster is gone, Micah," she promised, looking over his shoulder at the vast, undulating sea of green that stretched toward the horizon. "And we aren't running anymore." In the weeks that followed, the Black Ridge stopped being a place of exile and became a sanctuary. With Blaine's guidance, Lena learned the language of the timber, how to read the shift in the wind that signaled the entity's mood, and how to harvest the rare, silver-veined herbs that only grew where the ashfall touched the earth. They repaired the cabin, replacing the rusted metal with fresh-cut cedar, and planted a garden in the clearing that thrived in the nutrient-rich silt. The world outside eventually heard rumors of the disappearance of Andre Belloti and his elite squad. They talked of a curse in the woods, of a dark spirit that guarded the ridge with a vengeful fury. Lena let them talk. She knew that as long as the world feared the timber, she and Micah were safe. She was no longer the girl in the torn red shirt, clutching a child in the dark. She was the guardian of the ridge, the woman who had made a covenant with the shadows to protect the light. Every evening, As the sun dipped below the trees and the first few flakes of silver dust began to drift through the air, Lena would sit on the porch and hum the tune her mother used to sing. The woods would hum back, a low, resonant harmony that vibrated through the soles of her feet. The debt had been paid, the ledger was balanced, and in the heart of the forbidden woods, a new legacy was beginning. For the first time in her life, Lena Calloway wasn't just surviving. She was home.